So, Ultra, should we maybe delve a little bit into some of the papers that you had sent over? The second paper that you sent was a value of access to pasture as highly as to fresh feed. And I thought this
Mm-hmm.
was really, really cool because it's something that a lot of people, like from the emotional perspective, like we talked about, have wanted to highlight that there is this access to pasture for animals, whether it be chickens, cows, you name it, like the open pastures. It's interesting that the value, like, again, it's that value score that's assigned, which I always take, like, how does one define
Mm-hmm.
something like that? And I don't know if you can comment to us on how does someone define something like that, both in the paper sense, and then how would you, as you know, someone whose training is in this, but also you have the hands-on experience, like how accurate are these assessments of we value something and the animal values it? Like, do you see it firsthand? Like, would you say that yes, this evaluation is correct or not?
Oh, absolutely. And there's a bunch of different factors that you can do to measure what an animal values or what an animal wants. Absolutely, there is value. There was even sometimes we do experiments where we have the animal tell us what they want. Um, People who work with horses, you know that sometimes they're blanketed in the wintertime. And there's always a debate with horse people. When do you blanket your horse? When is it too cold? When do you, do I throw the blanket on now? And they actually trained horses to touch a sign. There are two signs. And one says, basically, they would have a group of horses with no blankets, and they would have a group of horses with blankets. And they were both trained for the different signs, and they would tell people they were trained to touch. Like, if I press this, a blanket is put on me. If I touch that, the blanket is taken off of me. And they were actually able to measure and gauge what specific temperatures, what weathers, what was going on, whether the horse was had its hair trimmed or not, which made it more likely to feel cold. And you can do things like that where it's like, you ask the animal, what's important to you? What do you want? What do you prefer? And, with cool experiments like that, the horse will actually just flat out tell you, this is what I want.
Is it hard to make blanket statements off that?
I would say with the horse study specifically, that might be a little blanket statement. Might be a little harder to make a blanket statement about that because horses with that specific thing, it might depend on the region. It might depend on the breed. Maybe it's a hardier breed that's more used to the cold. I think it's nice to look at that and go, oh, that's interesting. And, maybe I can apply that to my horse and see how that works. Whereas a lot of things, when we talk about motivations with animals, we're talking about key or behaviors. We're talking about things that are very instinctual and important to said animals.
In my mind, as you're telling this, I'm thinking about it. This is very similar to human studies. So by that, I mean is one of the caveats always whenever you do a human study, even if you do like a meta-analysis on existing data, is what is that population that you're taking from? And how much of it can be a blanket statement? Because if you just have college students at Duke, let's say, who have been sampled, that's not going to be representing the college students in like San Diego, but also it's not going to represent, the people who work in the jobs who are in their late 40s. And like, there's just a lot of these variables. So I guess, is it fair to say that with these studies on welfare and what's best for the animal, it's kind of like baby steps of going, what's the easiest means by we can get some kind of information, and then that just informs our practices. And it's not necessarily a truth like what we're searching for in science, like with like a research organism, but rather it's more of a guiding question of how can we make it best for the animal that we're caring for.
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of work to do with welfare and improving, the health and the contentness of animals is looking at these stereotypical behaviors and figuring out, well, why are you doing that? What is going on with your environment?
See, in the lab, it's such a different perspective. It's, oh, cool, I broke something. Why is that?
This is not a super nice topic, but veal calves, they're fed just milk. They're not given the ability to graze and forage and do what they naturally want to do once they get a certain age. So they do a thing called air licking, where it looks like they're licking the air and they're doing weird things with their mouths, and that's them trying to replicate grazing like they normally would be performing. And it's been shown that calves in this situation, the ones that do this air licking, they actually have less stomach ulcers and less health issues than the calves that are also, they're also not grazing, but they don't perform this abnormal behavior. They have more ulcers.
Is the not performing the abnormal behavior because the farmer doesn't want them to do it, or it's in some individuals and not in others?
Some individuals develop naturally this coping mechanism because the body is just kind of screaming at them like, you should be doing this with your tongue and your mouth, and you should be eating solid food, but you're not. And so it's not the farmer stopping it. It's just some of them have learned to develop this behavior to relax them and put them into a better state under the stress of they're not grazing.
So I wonder, like, with the flies for like decades plus, or the ants or mice, or even, fish, birds, what are we not thinking about? And of course, there's not an answer to that, but how important do you think, given your hands-on experience with the animals and their happiness, that having these accounted for could influence experimental outcomes?
The biggest thing that comes to mind right now is, and I kind of wanted to talk a little bit more about this with you because you mentioned it earlier, but stress, and especially long-term stress,
Okay.
can absolutely wildly affect experiments or results. And for me, that's like the biggest thing that comes to mind. Clearly, if you do, more long-term experiments, I think the welfare and the livelihood of the animal is more important in terms of, replicating how this organism would naturally be behaving or functioning on a cellular level. But like, the animal welfare person in me, just I primarily I really think about stress and how that really just changes not only the animal's behaviors, but like internally it changes a lot of things too.
I think first definition is, what is stress? And it's something that is, unfortunately, at least in our field, not standardized. Because stress could be anything from, if I put an insect into a higher temperature that it normally likes to live at, that's a stressor. If I give a mouse fox urine, that's a stress. Because they show like a fear response, and that's not even tied to like a molecule being released. That's just kind of how you said, Ultra, just like monitoring the visual of the animal's behavior and seeing if there is a difference in terms of like what it does from out of the ordinary. We stressed out our fruit flies, or we showed them a parasitic wasp, and they freaked out. They were jumping around like the container. They were trying to get away from it, and it wasn't even like that wasp can't kill that fly. It only affects its babies. So imagine the stress that's going on in this fly's brain of like, my babies are gonna get parasitized, and something else is gonna pop out of it. Now, it might not have that level of realization, but it definitely recognizes like a search image. Like, there is this stress response that's happening here. But where I think it gets difficult is studies that involve social behavior, which is kind of gets to humans and then also gets to the farm animals. Figuring out when to do the measurements for the question that you want is really difficult with those stressors.
That's super interesting, and it's really great to hear that from like a research perspective, because when I think about stress and I think about animal welfare, it's very complicated, very different. You can learn a lot of things, but at the same time, it's not the end all be all. Oh my goodness, there's a high level of cortisol. This animal is stressed, bad welfare. Sometimes relying too heavily on, stress and cortisol makes us feel like, when we look at an animal and it doesn't have high cortisol, oh, it must be okay. And
do you think, in your experience, like on the farm and with your background, is there something possible that you would replace instead of just a single chemical? Like, what would you, if you were designing your ideal paper,
Mm-hmm.
and money is no issue for this experiment, how would you gauge the stress of an animal of your choice? And then if you could define a broader definition to others, how would you do that?
Really, I mean, I think about my job on the farm, and I think about, when I go out and I see other farms or I go to zoos, the biggest thing is like stereotypical behavior and abnormal behaviors is like the biggest thing because or just even the demeanor of the animal, right? Like there's certain things that you could look at an animal if it's hunched, if it's we're talking about, the grimace scale or the face paint, you look at its face and how are its eyes looking? Is its jaw tight? Is it performing behaviors that it wouldn't normally behave? And typically when we're talking about stress, that's what comes to mind immediately is those types of things, because those are animals in like very high stress situations, and they're either showing it physically or through silly behaviors where it's like, why are you doing that? Well, there's now a need for a coping mechanism for that. So you have to look at things very holistically, and even then it's still, you're piecing together a puzzle and you're looking at all the clues for an animal and what works and what doesn't work. This is important for understanding. It's particularly so when we're talking about welfare and we're trying to connect with others and we're trying to have these conversations and maybe change minds, change policies, and find understandings in each other for why animal welfare is important. There's usually 4 pillars where people draw the importance of welfare. The first and foremost comes from the regular small farmer. This is kind of what you think about. They're out in the valley. It's not a huge farm. They've got maybe 200 cows. And it's not a huge farm, so they do have close personal connections with these animals. And they, interact with them on a daily basis. They're not necessarily just a number. But at the same time, to these farmers, this is still their livelihood. At the end of the day, they're producing something. And so there's kind of looking at it from the necessity of I make a living from these animals, but also there's more of a personal connection to them. There's the perspective of science and technology, where we're using animals in the lab. We're doing work with their genes, with their DNA, and how we treat them in the labs, and what can they do for us in terms of technology and advances and cool things like that. There's the sort of industrial view of animals, where we're talking. You have over 1,000 cows, right? You've got numbers. You're looking at numbers. You're looking at how productive your farm can be, and yes, you are interested in the health of your cows, but unlike the small farmer where, you've got 1 or 2 sick cows and you're like, oh my goodness, these 2 sick cows, you're looking at the overall broad spectrum of the health of the herd and how functional just your farm is from kind of like a zoomed out perspective. And then the last one, which is kind of where I relate more, it's from kind of a more romanticism point of view. There's a point in art history where we stopped just painting animals as background figures or as kind of side characters. Animals started being featured in art as the standalone subject. And you can see that with this development in art, we can see more emotion in the animals, more personality, more livelihood, just liveliness in them. And, you view animals more on an individual basis, from an emotional basis. They have personality, they're living beings, and you see the individual, and you're concerned about, the well-being of this individual. And so, and not everybody falls into one of these categories. You can kind of like, have perspectives in more than one. But it's really important that when we communicate these ideas and we share ideas, and we're trying to, especially with like policies and laws and regulations, if I'm talking to someone on a big, large farm and I want change to happen, I'm going to talk to them in the language that they understand and they value the animals, in which we benefit each other, versus me saying, oh, that poor sad cow. They're not going to care. That's not important to them. That's not what they value. But if I say, well, for the health and wellness of all of your animals, which in turn will help produce higher productivity levels, right? They can understand that. And I just want to say thank you again for having me here and for having these conversations. Like, I love that we have these conversations. I love that it helps people to understand the systems better and make informed decisions. So thank you for having me.
Thank you for being on here, Ultra, and hopefully we haven't scared you away from future collabs as well.
Oh no, not at all.
This was a lot of fun, and for lending your expertise and your time. And folks, please, I implore you to go follow Ultrasaurus. Thank you so much again for our questions and just your time and your expertise. We really, really appreciate it.
But yeah, thank you all so much.
Thank you, Ultra. Have a great rest of your night.
Okay. Bye.